2:15 in the morning, the Persian Gulf. A B-1B Lancer, callsign Bone 01, was already 3 hours into its mission when the world began to tilt. This was not a routine patrol. The crew would soon realize that the rules of engagement had been rewritten by an unknown force. The air at 28,000 feet was thin and freezing, but inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was thick with the hum of electronics and the smell of recycled oxygen. Major Miller adjusted the throttles. The vibration of the 4 General Electric engines was a steady, comforting presence through the floorboards of the cockpit. He checked his primary flight display. The digital horizon was stable. Then, a flicker occurred. It was a momentary ripple across the screen, a ghost in the machine that lasted less than a second. Miller glanced at his co-pilot. "Did you see that?" he asked. The co-pilot looked over, checking his own instruments. "Negative." "Seeing what?" Miller did not answer immediately. He returned his focus to the dark horizon, but the feeling of unease remained. It was a premonition that the calm of the night was about to shatter. In the back of the aircraft, Captain Reed sat before a glowing bank of monitors. He was the weapons systems officer, tasked with managing the complex electronic warfare suite of the heavy bomber. Bone 01. This is magic. Confirm your position. The voice of the airborne early warning controller crackled clearly in his headset. Reed checked his navigation computer. Magic. Bone 01 is on track. Point Whiskey. 28,000 feet. Speed 0.85 Mach. The controller paused for several seconds. Copy. We had a momentary drop on your transponder. Cycle your equipment. Reed frowned. He reached for the switches, but the equipment was already cycling itself without his input. 200 miles to the north, at a coastal battery near Bandar Abbas, the situation was far more urgent. The Iranian radar operators were staring at a screen that should have been clear. Instead, a contact had appeared out of nowhere. It did not behave like a standard aircraft. It had no transponder code, and its radar return was flickering. On the digital tactical map, the American bomber was listed as a Phantom. The battery commander, Colonel Vahidi, stood behind the lead operator. "Classify that contact," Vahidi ordered. His voice was sharp. The operator typed rapidly, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Sir, it has the radar cross-section of a bone, but the signature is shifting. It is erratic. The system cannot maintain a stable track." The tension began to climb as the distance between the two forces closed. In the American cockpit, the defensive management system suddenly screamed. It was a sharp, rhythmic tone that every pilot feared. It was the sound of a high-powered search radar finding them. This was not a casual sweep from a distance. It was a persistent, focused beam of energy intended to lock a target. Miller felt the hair on his arms stand up beneath his flight suit. "We are being painted," Reed said from the back. His voice was tense but professional. "Big Bird radar. It is an S-300 battery. They are looking right at us." Miller gripped the control stick tighter. "We are in international airspace. They have no reason to lock." The tone changed. It became faster and more aggressive. The Iranian battery had transitioned from search to track. The situational awareness of the crew shifted instantly from routine to survival. Magic. Bone 01. We are being spiked by a long-range surface-to-air missile site. Location is Bandar Abbas. The controller responded immediately. Copy. Bone. We see the emission. We are vectoring the 15E escorts to your position. Maintain course. Do not deviate. The Iranian colonel at Bandar Abbas did not see the escorts yet. His focus was entirely on the large icon in the center of his screen. To him, this was an intruder, a provocation that required an immediate response. "Target is confirmed," Vahidi said. He did not want a war, but his orders were absolute. Any hostile contact approaching the restricted zone was to be engaged. The digital logic of the S-300 system agreed. It provided a launch solution. The range was 45 nautical miles. The probability of a kill was 92%. Inside the Lancer, the warning tone changed again. It was now a continuous, high-pitched wail. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 2:22 in the morning. Lieutenant Kazemi watched the primary air defense display in the Bandar Abbas command bunker. The American bomber was a steady, glowing amber icon on his screen. It was moving at a predictable speed on a standard track. Then, without any manual input, the amber icon turned to a pulsing crimson. The word hostile appeared in sharp white letters across the center of his display. Kazemi blinked, his fingers hovering over the trackball. He had not authorized a change in status. The system had decided on its own. Colonel Vahidi. "Look at the tactical link," Kazemi said. His voice was low, strained by the sudden shift in the room. Vahidi stepped over from the communication station. He looked at the red icon and the data block beside it. The altitude was steady at 28,000 feet. The heading was unchanged. But the system was now reporting an electronic signature it categorized as an active jamming signal. "I am not seeing any jamming on the wideband receiver," Vahidi noted. He adjusted his headset. "Is it a software error?" Kazemi shook his head. "I have attempted to reset the classification 3 times. The system overrides me instantly. It is designating the bone as an immediate threat." The command center was now alive with the sound of keys clicking and urgent murmurs. The automated logic of the S-300 system was beginning to prepare for an engagement. It was calculating intercept geometries. It was warming up the phased array emitters. Vahidi reached for the radio handset. He would give the Americans one chance to turn away. The radio crackled inside the cockpit of Bone 01, unidentified military aircraft on heading 120. "You are ordered to alter your course to the south immediately. If you do not comply, you will be engaged." Major Miller exchanged a look with his co-pilot. "Magic, did you catch that?" Miller asked. The airborne early warning controller responded immediately. "Copy. Bone. We are monitoring. You are currently 12 miles outside their territorial waters. You are in legal international airspace. Do not deviate. We are transmitting a formal protest to their regional center now." Miller gripped the throttles. He could feel the tension radiating from the back of the jet. Captain Reed was staring at his electronic warfare screens. "Sir, the S-300 is in a full target track mode. They are not just looking, they are aiming. And there is something else. My system is showing a secondary radar source. It is right on top of us." Miller looked out the side window into the black void. He saw nothing but the faint glow of the stars and the wingtips of his own aircraft. "What do you mean on top of us? Is it a drone?" Reed paused, his eyes scanning the digital waterfall of data. "No, it is not a physical object. It is a signal. It is perfectly synchronized with our own radar return. To the Iranians, it looks like we are accelerating, but our airspeed is constant." This was the anomaly. The Iranian screens were now showing the B-1B Lancer jumping forward in short, impossible bursts of speed. To Kazemi and Vahidi, it looked like the American bomber was beginning a high-speed attack run toward the coast. The distance on the screen dropped from 40 miles to 30 in a matter of seconds. It was a physical impossibility for a bomber of that size, but the computer did not care about physics. It only cared about the data. "He is closing the distance!" Kazemi shouted. The red icon was now flashing. The automated voice of the battery's fire control system spoke through the room's speakers. "Target within engagement envelope. Ready to launch." Vahidi hesitated. His hand was on the authorization key. He looked at the secondary sensors. The infrared cameras showed the bomber still cruising at its original speed. But the radar, the primary sensor for the missiles, insisted the threat was seconds away from the launch line. Inside the bomber, the warning tones became a physical weight. The crew was trapped between the reality of their instruments and the phantom signal that was provoking an international crisis. Miller looked at the fuel gauge and then at the dark horizon ahead. He knew the 15E escorts, Eagle 4-1 and Eagle 4-2, were still 5 minutes away. A new sound erupted in the cockpit. It was a digital chirping. It was not coming from the Iranian radar. It was coming from the flight control system itself. The control stick in Miller's hand vibrated once, then twice. A message appeared on the center console in a font he had never seen before. It read, "Equilibrium established. Read." "What the hell was that?" Miller asked. Reed didn't answer. He was staring at a blank screen. His entire electronic warfare suite had just rebooted. In the silence that followed, a single, new contact appeared on the radar. It was positioned exactly halfway between the bomber and the Iranian coast. It was not moving. It had no transponder. And it was huge. The dark expanse of the Persian Gulf felt smaller than it had only minutes before. Inside the cockpit of Bone 01, Major Miller felt the physical resistance of the aircraft. The flight controls were no longer fluid. They felt heavy, as if the bomber were flying through a different medium. The message on the center console had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the technical reality it left behind was undeniable. Miller looked at the primary flight display. The airspeed indicator was spinning. It showed 400 knots, then 200, then 600. Captain Reed was working his consoles with a frantic precision. The electronic warfare suite was back online, but the data it provided was nonsensical. The massive contact sat directly on their nose. It was 30 miles away. It was 20,000 feet in altitude. According to the radar, it was nearly 400 meters long. It was a monolithic presence in the sky that should not have existed. Magic. Bone 01. Do you have the new contact? Reed transmitted. The response from the airborne early warning aircraft was hesitant. Bone. Magic. We have a massive amount of clutter in your sector. We are calling it a weather phenomenon. Cloud density is off the charts. Reed keyed his mic immediately. Negative. Magic. This is not weather. We have a solid radar return. It is stationary. I repeat, it is stationary at 20,000 feet. A long silence followed on the radio. At that altitude, nothing stays stationary unless it is an airship or a helicopter. This was neither. It was a radar shadow so deep it seemed to swallow the energy of the surrounding airspace. To the north, the Iranian command center was experiencing a different kind of chaos. Colonel Vahidi stood over the radar operator. The S-300 system was struggling to maintain its lock on the American bomber. The giant contact was acting like a natural shield. It was positioned perfectly between the battery and the bone. To the automated systems of the air defense site, it looked like the Americans had deployed a massive electronic countermeasure. They are hiding behind a screen, Vahidi said. His voice was a low growl. He believed the Americans were using a new type of stealth technology. To his eyes, the massive contact was a decoy, a trick designed to mask an incoming strike. Is the missile ready? Vahidi asked. The operator nodded. His hand was shaking slightly. The seeker head is cooled. The guidance logic is green, but the lock is intermittent. Vahidi leaned in. Force the lock. Use the high-gain mode. We cannot let them bypass the perimeter. 60 miles to the south, the two 15E Strike Eagles were pushing their engines to the limit. They were flying at Mach 1.2. The roar of their afterburners was a twin thunder over the water. The lead pilot, callsign Eagle 41, was squinting through his night vision goggles. Eagle 42, this is lead. Do you see that? Lead. 42, I see the silhouette. It is blocking the stars. It looks like a mountain in the sky. The escorts were closing the gap. They were now within 30 miles of Bone 01. Their radar systems were also struggling. The massive contact was emitting a low-frequency hum that interfered with their targeting computers. It was not jamming in the traditional sense. It was more like a background noise that made every other signal seem faint and distant. Major Miller checked his fuel. The erratic movements of the flight controls were burning more propellant than planned. He had to make a decision. If he turned south, he would be admitting defeat to a phantom. If he continued forward, he would fly directly into the center of the massive contact. Bone 01. This is magic. The controller's voice was now urgent. We have multiple launches from the Bandar Abbas site. I repeat, vampires are inbound. 6 missiles in the air. Time to impact is 80 seconds. Miller felt a cold rush of adrenaline. He looked at his co-pilot. There was no more time for technical analysis. The Iranians had fired. The rules of engagement were now written in fire. The bone was a large target. It was not a fighter. It could not pull high-G maneuvers to outrun a surface-to-air missile. Its only defense was its electronic suite and its flares. Reed, deploy everything, Miller ordered. Sir, my systems are not responding to manual commands, Reed shouted back. The computer is locking me out. It is holding our heading. The bomber continued to fly straight and level. It was heading directly toward the massive contact. The 6 Iranian missiles were climbing high into the atmosphere, arching over the Gulf. They were accelerating to Mach 4. They were seeking the heat of the 4 large engines. On the radar screen, the 6 red dots were closing fast on the single amber icon. Miller gripped the controls so hard his knuckles turned white. He watched the countdown on his screen. 40 seconds to impact. 30 seconds. The massive contact was now only 5 miles ahead. It looked like a hole in the universe, a black void that consumed all light. Then, the first missile crossed the threshold. The blue-lit interior of the Combat Information Center aboard the United States ship Wyoming was a hive of controlled aggression. Admiral Vance stood behind the primary tactical display. The red icons representing the Iranian missiles were arcing across the screen. Each one was a spear aimed at the heart of a billion-dollar aircraft and its crew. The air in the room was cold, kept at a precise temperature for the computers, but Vance could feel the heat of the moment rising. "Status of the escort flight," Vance ordered. The tactical officer responded immediately. Eagle 4-1 and 4-2 are in range. They have a solid track on the Bandar Abbas battery. They are requesting permission to engage with anti-radiation missiles. Vance looked at the timeline. The Iranian missiles would impact the B-1B in less than 60 seconds. If he authorized a strike on the battery, it would be an escalation from which there was no return. "Wait," Vance said. His eyes were fixed on the center of the display. "Look at the track of the incoming missiles." The tactical officer leaned forward. The 6 red dots were no longer moving in a smooth arc. As they approached the massive, stationary contact, their flight paths began to warp. It was as if the air itself had become viscous. The missiles were slowing down. This was a physical impossibility. Inside the cockpit of Eagle 4-1, the pilot was screaming into his mask. "Magic, we have a lock. Permission to fire. I say again, permission to fire. Bone 0. 1 is about to be hit." The controller's voice was strangely calm. "Eagle 4-1. Hold your fire. Observe the target." The pilot looked through his targeting pod. The 6 Iranian missiles had reached the outer edge of the massive black void. Instead of passing through it to reach the bomber, they were being pulled toward its center. Inside the B-1B Lancer, Major Miller watched the countdown timer on his defensive display. It should have reached 0 10 seconds ago. "Reed, talk to me. Where are those missiles?" Miller asked. Captain Reed was staring out the small, thick window of his station. "Sir, you are not going to believe this. They are right beside us." Miller looked out his own window. 3 of the Iranian missiles were hovering less than 50 feet from the wingtip of the Lancer. Their engines were still firing. A blinding torrent of orange flame was erupting from their nozzles. But they were not moving forward. They were suspended in the air. The sight was terrifying. The warheads were live. The proximity fuses were active. Any slight deviation in flight would cause a detonation that would vaporize the bomber instantly. "They are tethered," Reed whispered. "Something is holding them in place." At the Bandar Abbas site, Colonel Vahidi had lost all control. His screens were white with static. The S-300 system was screaming a series of error codes that the technicians had never seen before. The computer was reporting that the missiles had reached the target, but it was also reporting that they were still in flight. "Launch the second salvo," Vahidi commanded. He was in a state of pure panic. "Fire everything we have. Clear the sky." The battery operators complied. Another 4 missiles roared off their pads with a deafening sequence of thuds. The earth shook as the heavy interceptors climbed into the night. The second salvo was crossing the 10-mile mark. The first salvo was still hanging off the wing of the Lancer. The situation was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The air over the Strait of Hormuz was thick with the scent of ozone and the invisible weight of high-energy radar waves. Inside the B-1B Lancer, the cockpit had become a room of impossible geometry. Major Miller looked to his left. 3 missiles remained frozen in the air, their rocket motors churning out a fury of white heat that should have propelled them at 3,000 miles per hour. Instead, they drifted like captive birds, locked in a digital cage. "Magic. Bone 01. We have a second launch from the coast," Captain Reed reported. His voice was higher now, stripped of its professional veneer. 4 more incoming. They are accelerating. These are not being held. I repeat, the second salvo is not being held. The tactical situation was deteriorating at a speed that exceeded human reaction time. On the Iranian coast, the S-300 battery had entered a state of automated frenzy. The software, unable to reconcile the frozen missiles with the data from its sensors, had defaulted to a maximum effort engagement. Colonel Vahidi watched the monitors as 4 more streaks of light climbed into the sky. He was no longer a commander. He was a spectator to a process he had initiated but could no longer stop. "Target distance, 8 miles, the Iranian operator shouted. 6 miles. The seeker heads have acquired the large contact. Impact in 10 seconds. Inside the American bomber, the alarms reached a crescendo. The defensive systems were no longer chirping. They were emitting a single, flat tone that signaled certain destruction. Miller pulled back on the stick, trying to climb, but the aircraft refused to respond. It was as if the B-1B were no longer a machine of metal and engines, but a piece of a larger, invisible architecture. "They are going to hit the void," Miller said. He watched the infrared display. The 4 new missiles were closing the gap with terrifying precision. Unlike the first group, these were moving with their full kinetic energy. They were 4 tons of high explosive and jagged steel, traveling at Mach 4. The distance closed, 7,000 meters, 5,000, 3,000. The massive stationary void in the sky did not move. It did not emit a countermeasure. It simply existed. Eagle 4-1. "This is magic. All units, break away. Turn to heading 180. Maximum afterburner," the controller commanded. The 215E escorts banked hard, their wings screaming as they pulled 9 times the force of gravity. They dumped their remaining flares, creating a waterfall of magnesium light in the darkness, and fled the engagement zone. They were the lucky ones. They still had control over their flight paths. Major Miller looked at his co-pilot. There was no point in shouting. There was no point in praying. The 4 missiles reached the edge of the black void. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to pause. The sound of the B-1B's engines vanished. The vibration in the floorboard stopped. Every light in the cockpit flickered and died, leaving the crew in a darkness so absolute it felt physical. "Sir, I cannot see the instruments," the co-pilot whispered. "I know," Miller replied. Outside the canopy, the second salvo of missiles impacted the outer boundary of the stationary contact. There was no flash of light. There was no thunderous roar. The missiles simply ceased to be. They did not explode. They were not deflected. They hit the surface of the void and were erased, as if they had never been manufactured. But the energy they carried had to go somewhere. The physics of the universe demanded a balance. The void began to pulse. A deep, low-frequency hum vibrated through the hull of the B-1B, a sound so powerful it felt like it was liquid. The 3 missiles that had been hovering beside the bomber's wing began to glow. The white heat of their engines turned a brilliant, searing violet. "Reed, what is happening?" Miller yelled over the rising hum. "The signatures are reversing." Reed's voice came through the intercom, distorted by heavy static. "The guidance systems, they are being reprogrammed. Something is sending them back." The 3 violet glowing missiles began to rotate. They did not turn in a wide arc. They flipped 180 degrees in a single frame of reality. Their noses were now pointed directly back at the Iranian battery that had launched them. The morning was no longer quiet. The fuse had been lit. 2:42 in the morning. The Persian Gulf. The violet light from the suspended missiles became a blinding glare. The physical laws of the cockpit had dissolved. Major Miller felt his stomach drop as the B-1B Lancer was suddenly released from its invisible tether. Gravity returned with a violent, bone-crushing force. The aircraft plummeted 300 feet in a single second. The airframe groaned, a deep, metallic shriek that vibrated through the pilot's seats. Then, the first detonation occurred. One of the 3 missiles that had been hovering near the left wing did not turn back. Its guidance logic, corrupted by the energy of the void, reached a terminal failure. The proximity fuse triggered. The warhead detonated 5 meters from the leading edge of the wing. The blast was a wall of orange fire and jagged titanium fragments traveling at 4,000 feet per second. The heat blast swept across the cockpit glass, instantly bubbling the specialized coating. The pressure wave slammed into the hull with the force of a high-speed collision, compressing the chests of the crew and knocking the breath from their lungs. The shriek of tearing metal drowned out the engines. The explosion punched clean through the aluminum skin of the left wing, shredding the secondary fuel cell and severing the hydraulic lines to the number 1 and number 2 engines. A massive section of the wing's trailing edge was ripped apart, thrown clear into the dark sky like autumn leaves in a hurricane. Hot hydraulic fluid sprayed into the air and ignited instantly, creating a blowtorch of flame that trailed 200 feet behind the bomber. Inside the cockpit, the world was a centrifuge of chaos. Losing number 1. Number 2 is failing, Miller shouted. His voice was a rasp. The shockwave had cracked his helmet visor. He jammed the control stick hard to the right to compensate for the massive loss of lift on the left side. The aircraft responded sluggishly, rolling toward the dark water below. The smell of burning propellant and scorched metal filled the cabin, acrid and thick. In the back, Captain Reed was thrown against his restraints. His monitors were shattered, the glass shards glinting in the light of the fire outside. "We are hit! We are hit!" he gasped into the intercom. "Fire in the wing! Bleed air is red! We are losing the left side!" The B-1B was no longer a graceful predator. It was a wounded giant. The number 1 engine disintegrated as the shrapnel from the wing was sucked into the intake, the turbine blades shattering and exploding outward through the nacelle. The aircraft shuddered violently. Below them, the Iranian battery operators watched the fireball in the sky. To them, it was a victory. They saw the explosion. They saw the massive bomber begin its slow, burning descent. But the celebration lasted exactly 4 seconds. The remaining 2 missiles, still glowing with that impossible violet energy, did not fall. They did not waver. They accelerated. They were no longer seeking a radar return or a heat signature. They were slave to the exact coordinates of the Bandar Abbas launch site. They tore through the air with a high-pitched scream. "They are coming back!" Lieutenant Kazemi screamed in the bunker. He looked at the secondary radar. The 2 signatures were moving at Mach 5. There were no countermeasures for a missile that already knew its home. The air around the B-1B was filled with black smoke and the flickering light of burning debris. The bomber was falling through 20,000 feet, trailing a river of fire. Miller fought the controls, his muscles screaming against the hydraulic failure. He could see the lights of the Iranian coast ahead. He could see the 2 violet streaks of light passing beneath him, heading for the shore. The exchange of fire was complete. The damage was confirmed. Both sides had drawn blood. The morning was no longer a standoff. It was a slaughter. The Bandar Abbas Air Defense Complex, the 2 violet glowing missiles crossed the coastline in a heartbeat. Inside the command bunker, the air felt electric. The hair on the operator's arms standing up as a low-frequency hum vibrated the reinforced concrete walls. Colonel Vahidi stared at the main tactical screen. The 2 red icons were no longer tracking toward the American bomber. They were tracking toward the center of the room. The first missile struck the primary phased array radar tower and disintegrated. The warhead punched through the hardened steel base and detonated inside the electronic core. The tower, a massive structure of lattice, steel, and sophisticated emitters, was cut in half by the blast. It blew straight up off its foundation, spinning 10 meters into the air before crashing down onto the auxiliary generator building. The explosion was a fireball that turned the sky white for 3 miles in every direction, followed by the shriek of tearing metal as the structure collapsed inward. The second missile impacted the launch rail of the number 4 battery, where 2 remaining S-300 interceptors were still fueled and ready. The impact ignited the solid rocket propellant of the unlaunched missiles instantly. The result was a catastrophic chain reaction. The launch vehicle was shredded, thrown clear across the perimeter fence in a spray of molten metal and burning chemical fuel. The concussion compressed every chest in the vicinity, shattering the windows of the command bunker and throwing the operators from their chairs. Black smoke climbed from the wreckage of the battery, rolling upward in a dense column that obscured the stars. The heat blast swept across the tarmac, melting the tires of nearby transport trucks. 3 seconds of dead silence fell across the Iranian radio frequency. Voices erupted on every channel at once, screaming for medical support and fire suppression. The battery was not just damaged, it had been erased. Then everything changed. At the exact moment of impact on the ground, the massive black void in the sky vanished. It was simply gone. But it left behind a vacuum of data that crashed every electronic system in a 50-mile radius. Inside the cockpit of the crippled Bone 01, Major Miller felt the aircraft lurch. The violet light was replaced by a darkness so profound it felt like blindness. The screaming alarms in his headset cut to a dead, flat silence. Every screen in the cockpit, the primary flight displays, the engine monitors, the defensive suites went black. Even the backup analog dials, which relied on mechanical gyros, began to spin wildly. Miller, "Everything is dead," the co-pilot yelled. His voice sounded small in the suddenly quiet cockpit. "I have no stick. I have no rudder," Miller replied, his voice strained as he pulled against the dead controls. The bomber was still on fire. The left wing was trailing a river of burning fuel, and the number one engine was a twisted wreck of metal. Without flight computers or hydraulic pressure, the B-1B was just 60,000 pounds of falling steel. They were descending through 15,000 feet, dropping at a rate of 4,000 feet per minute. Then, a new signal appeared on a single, old-fashioned cathode ray tube screen in the back, a piece of legacy equipment that Reed used for raw signal monitoring. The screen flickered to life, displaying a single, steady line of green text in a language that was neither English nor Farsi. The text remained for 3 seconds. Then, it shifted into a geometric pattern, a perfect circle with a horizontal line through the center. As the pattern appeared, the B-1B's controls suddenly snapped back to center. The hydraulic pressure surged to green. The fires in the wing did not go out, but they were suddenly contained behind an invisible barrier, the flames licking against the air but no longer spreading. "I have the aircraft," Miller shouted. "Pressure is back. I have authority." "Sir," Reed called, "I am looking at a ghost signal. It is a wide-spectrum broadcast. It is being transmitted from the impact site at Bandar Abbas, and it is being transmitted from right here, inside our own hull." The pivot had occurred. The battle had been interrupted by something that treated both sides as children playing with matches. As the B-1B leveled off at 10,000 feet, the crew looked out the windows. The sky was clear. The void was gone. But on the horizon, the fires of the Bandar Abbas battery were still burning, a grim reminder that the combat had been very, very real. 2:55 in the morning. The sky over the Persian Gulf was a graveyard of electronic signals. Inside the cockpit of Bone 01, the immediate terror of the crash had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating confusion. Major Miller held the control stick with both hands, feeling the unnatural smoothness of the flight controls, while the left wing was a jagged ruin and the number one engine was a hollowed-out shell. Yet, the bomber flew as if it were on rails. There was no roll, no yaw, and no struggle against the thin air. "Check the backup systems," Miller commanded, his voice steady now, though the adrenaline still hummed in his veins. The co-pilot flipped a series of switches on the overhead panel as analog gauges spun, and the standby altimeter stuck at 15,000 feet. The black screens had transitioned to a deep, monochromatic violet, with no numbers or artificial horizons. Instead, a series of pulses moved across the glass, rhythmic and slow, like the beating of a heart. In the back, Captain Reed was staring at the legacy cathode ray tube where the green geometric circle remained fixed. "Major, I am losing the feed from Magic. The entire radio spectrum is dead. Not just jammed, it is gone. There is no background radiation. No static, no white noise. It is as if the atmosphere has been stripped of its ability to carry a wave." Reed reached for the emergency hand-cranked radio, a piece of equipment designed for the most extreme survival scenarios. He put on the headset and listened, but heard nothing. Not even the hum of the aircraft's own electrical system. 50 miles away, the situation at the Bandar Abbas command bunker was a mirror of the American experience. Colonel Vahidi pushed open the heavy steel door of the bunker, stepping out into the heat of the burning battery. The air smelled of scorched earth as the primary radar tower stood as a heap of twisted, glowing metal. The wreckage of the launch vehicles flickered with low blue flames that did not seem to produce smoke. His soldiers were standing in the darkness, their flashlights failing one by one, and the batteries in their radios were dead. Even the wristwatches on their arms had stopped at exactly 2:43. Vahidi looked up at the sky. He expected to see American fighters diving for a second strike. He expected to see the horizon filled with the glow of incoming cruise missiles. Instead, the sky was empty and terrifyingly clear. "Colonel, the backup landline is active," a young officer shouted from the bunker entrance. Vahidi ran back inside and picked up the heavy, old-fashioned receiver. It was a hardwired connection that bypassed the digital network, a relic of the Cold War. "This is Vahidi." "Who is this?" asked Vahidi as a voice from the regional command center crackled through distortion. "Colonel, report status. We have lost all satellite coverage. The entire southern coast is blind. What happened to the American target?" "The target is hit," Vahidi replied, looking at the dead monitors. But we were hit in return by our own weapons, the missiles. They turned around. They were glowing, General. They were violet. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before the general replied, "Colonel, you are reporting a technical impossibility. Secure your perimeter. We are sending an investigative team by ground vehicle. Nothing is flying. Every jet that attempted to scramble has suffered total engine failure on the runway." Back on Bone 01, the violet pulses on the cockpit screens began to accelerate. Miller watched as the pulses coalesced into a map. It was not a map of the Gulf, but a topographical representation of the seabed below them. A single point was blinking red, positioned in the deepest part of the Strait of Hormuz. "It wants us to see that," Reed said over the intercom, his voice no longer distorted. "See what?" Miller asked as the internal communication system was co-opted by the force flying the plane. "The impact point, not the one on the coast. The place where the void first appeared. Something is down there, Major, and it is not finished with us." The bomber began a slow bank to the south, while Miller did not touch the stick. The aircraft was turning toward the coordinates on the screen. Below them, in the dark water, a faint violet glow began to rise to the surface. It was not a fire. It was an illumination that spanned several miles of the ocean floor. The two 15E escorts, Eagle 4-1 and 4-2, were nowhere to be found. They had been pushed out of the zone by the shockwave of the pivot. Miller and his crew were alone with the mystery. They were a burning aircraft held together by a force they could not name, flying toward a destination they did not choose. The morning was silent. The transition into the next phase of the crisis had begun. 3:10 in the morning, the dark surface of the Persian Gulf began to churn. The violet glow from beneath the waves was no longer a faint shimmer. Major Miller looked down through the cockpit glass. The B-1B Lancer, still trailing a thin ribbon of smoke from its shattered left wing, stabilized at 5,000 feet. The engines were still running, but the sound they made was no longer a roar. It was a rhythmic, harmonic hum that resonated in the pilots' chests. "Major, look at the guard frequency," Captain Reed called out. A series of rapid, percussive tones began to fill the cockpit. The violet pulses on the cockpit monitors synchronized with the sound. The topographical map of the seafloor revealed a structure that was miles wide. "Magic. Any station. This is Bone 01. Do you read?" Miller transmitted into the void. "Bone 01. This is the Bandar Abbas ground station. We hear you. Major. My men are reporting that the fires on our launchers have simply stopped. The heat is gone, but the metal is still glowing. Bone. This is Eagle 4-1. We are 5 miles to your south. We cannot close the distance. It is like hitting a wall of static." Below the bomber, a massive obsidian-colored spire began to break the surface of the water. It rose without a splash, the water cascading off its sides like silk. As it reached its full height, the violet glow in the water gathered around its base, spiraling upward like a liquid nebula. The B-1B slowed to a hover. The aircraft hung in the air, suspended directly in front of the massive black spire. The jagged, blackened edges of the left wing were being covered by a fine, silver mist. The metal was knitting itself back together. The shattered turbine blades of the number 1 engine were being pulled back into alignment by invisible fingers. On the Iranian shore, a second spire began to rise from the sand. The two objects began to project a beam of white light toward each other. The beams met directly over the center of the strait, forming a bridge of energy. The morning was now the color of a dying star. The Persian Gulf, the bridge of white light connecting the two spires, one in the sea and one on the Iranian coast, pulsed with a low, rhythmic vibration. Inside the cockpit of Bone 01, the crew sat in a state of suspended animation. The B-1B Lancer was now fully repaired. The jagged holes in the wing had been sealed with a smooth silver composite that hummed when touched. The number 1 engine, once a blackened ruin, was spinning at a perfect idle. "Major, all systems are back in the green," the co-pilot reported. His voice was hushed, as if he were in a cathedral. "Hydraulics at 3,000 pounds per square inch. Fuel flow is nominal. It is like the engagement never happened." Major Miller did not look at the gauges. He was watching the white bridge of light. He could see figures moving within the beam distortions in the air that looked like heat haze. They were not human. They moved with a geometric precision that mirrored the symbols on Captain Reed's monitors. Magic. This is Bone 01. Do you have a visual on the bridge? Miller transmitted. The response did not come from the airborne early warning aircraft. It came from the Bridge of Light itself. A voice filled the cockpit, speaking not through the speakers, but directly into the minds of the crew. Conflict is the primary entropy of your species. It has been measured. It has been found wanting. Captain Reed looked at his screens. The green circle was gone. In its place was a scrolling list of every weapon launched in the last hour. The flight paths of the Iranian S-300 missiles were overlaid with the flight path of the B-1B. The computer was showing the exact moment the combat climax had occurred. The impact, the fire, the damage. They were waiting for us to fire, Reed whispered. The void didn't appear because we were here. It appeared because we chose to kill each other. 40 miles away, Colonel Vahidi stood at the edge of the Iranian spire. His men had lowered their weapons. There was no one to fight. The American bomber was visible on the horizon, a dark silhouette against the white light. But it was no longer an enemy. It was a fellow witness to an intervention that had made their geopolitical grievances look like the squabbles of children. General, this is Vahidi. The colonel spoke into his landline. The bridge is active. The Americans are holding station. I am ordering my men to begin search and rescue for the casualties from the initial blast. We are treating this as a mutual disaster. Agreed. The general's voice came through, weary and subdued. The Americans have signaled a similar intent. Their destroyers are moving to pick up our sailors who were blown overboard. There is a temporary understanding. The search and rescue operations began in a strange, haunting silence. American Seahawk helicopters flew alongside Iranian patrol boats. Their searchlights crossed in the dark, looking for survivors in the water where the missiles had first frozen in the air. There was no chatter on the radio. No tactical coordination was needed. Every pilot and captain knew what had to be done. The ghost signal was providing the coordinates of every man in the water. Inside the Lancer, Major Miller felt the flight controls return to his manual authority. The heavy, guided sensation vanished. The aircraft felt light and responsive again. Major, the spires are fading, the co-pilot said. Miller looked out. The white bridge was losing its density. The obsidian pillars were beginning to sink back into the sea and the sand, leaving behind nothing but the smell of ozone. The massive intervention was withdrawing, its point made. It had stopped a war by proving that the weapons of the two greatest powers in the region were toys, compared to the forces that watched from the shadows. Heading south, 200, Miller commanded. Let's go home. The Lancer banked away from the coast, its engines glowing with a standard orange flame. Behind them, the lights of the Iranian rescue boats twinkled like stars. For the first time in history, the two nations were moving in the same direction for the same reason. The crisis had resolved, but the silence that followed was heavier than the sound of the explosions. 3 days later at the Pentagon, the windowless briefing room in the basement of the E-Ring was filled with a dry, recycled air that tasted of static. Admiral Vance sat at the head of a mahogany table, surrounded by the highest level of strategic analysts the United States military could assemble. On the wall-sized screen behind him, a high-resolution satellite image showed the Strait of Hormuz. The water was calm. There was no trace of the obsidian spire, no ripple from where the massive void had once sat. Gentlemen, let us look at the telemetry one more time, Vance said. His voice was tired. He had not slept more than 4 hours since the engagement. A series of lines appeared on the screen, tracing the flight of the Iranian S-300 missiles. The red lines moved toward the B-1B Lancer, then abruptly reversed. The physics of the turnaround were the focus of the meeting. The computer models could not replicate the maneuver. To turn a Mach 4 missile 180 degrees in a fraction of a second without the airframe disintegrating required a manipulation of inertia that was beyond human understanding. The metal recovered from the Iranian launch site is the most troubling part, one analyst noted, tapping a tablet. The Iranians have shared a small sample through back channels in Switzerland. It is not their alloy. It is not ours. The molecular structure has been realigned. It is essentially a single crystal of titanium, grown in seconds. It is harder than diamond and 5 times as light. The strategic assessment was grim. The engagement had proved that the most advanced kinetic weapons in the world were obsolete the moment an outside force decided they were. The political fallout was equally complex. Both Washington and Tehran had officially categorized the incident as a catastrophic technical malfunction involving an atmospheric anomaly. Neither side wanted to admit they had been neutralized by a superior power. "And the crew?" Vance asked. "Major Miller and his team are still in isolation at Nellis," an intelligence officer replied. "Their testimonies are consistent. They describe a forced intervention. They describe a voice. We have checked the black box audio. There is no voice on the recording. Only 30 seconds of high-frequency white noise that correlates with the mental communication they report." Vance looked at the image of the B-1B sitting in a hangar. The silver patches on the wing were still there. The repair was not a patch, it was a transmutation of the metal. The aircraft was now the most valuable piece of technology on the planet, and yet, no scientist could explain how it worked. It was a gift that felt like a warning. Across the world, in a secure facility outside Tehran, Colonel Vahidi sat in a similar room. He was no longer in uniform. He wore a plain gray suit, but his eyes still held the reflection of the violet light. He was looking at a map of the region, dotted with the locations of every air defense battery. "We cannot rebuild the Bandar Abbas site," his superior told him. "The ground there is different. The soil has been vitrified. Nothing grows. No sensor can maintain a calibration within 5 kilometers of the impact point. The Americans call it a dead zone. We call it a silent zone." Vahidi nodded. He thought of the American pilot, Miller. He wondered if the major was also staring at a wall, trying to find a place for the experience in a world that still insisted on the old rules of power. The strategic assessment was the same in both languages. The balance of power had not shifted between nations. It had shifted away from humanity entirely. The political fallout was managed through a series of quiet agreements. The two nations established a permanent hotline, not for diplomatic relations, but for anomaly coordination. The price of the engagement was the loss of a battery and the near loss of a bomber, but the cost to their collective ego was far higher. They were no longer the masters of their own territory. "The world thinks we almost started a war," Vance said to the quiet room. "The truth is, someone else finished it for us, and we are not even sure who someone else is." The meeting ended without a conclusion. There was no plan for a counterattack. There was no strategy for defense. There was only a quiet, desperate hope that whatever had stepped into the Strait of Hormuz that night was satisfied with the lesson it had taught. 1 month later, in the high desert of Nevada, Major Miller stood on the edge of the flight line at Nellis Air Force Base. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of deep orange and bruised purple. Behind him, the hangar doors were closed, sheltering the B-1B Lancer from the prying eyes of satellite surveillance. The aircraft was no longer a weapon of war. It had become a relic, a piece of evidence in a case that would likely never be closed. The silver repairs on the wing still caught the fading light, glowing with a faint, internal warmth that defied the cooling desert air. Miller reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of titanium. It was a fragment of the Iranian missile that had hit them. It felt heavier than it should. It felt like a stone from another world. "They are moving us to the north slope," Captain Reed said, walking up beside him. His face was pale. "They want us away from the main population. Total isolation. They are calling it a safety protocol. We know it is a gag order." Miller nodded. He looked out at the distant mountains. "We saw it, Reed. We felt it. They can hide the plane, and they can hide us. But they cannot hide the fact that the rules have changed. The ocean is not empty. The sky is not ours." The strategic assessment of the engagement had reached a final, terrifying conclusion. The intervention in the Strait of Hormuz was not an act of peace. It was an act of management. The spires in the void were not tools of a savior, but the equipment of a gardener weeding a bed that had grown too chaotic. The two most powerful militaries in the region had been neutralized as easily as one might blow out a candle. In Washington and Tehran, the rhetoric of war had been replaced by a quiet, frantic cooperation. The anomaly coordination hotline was active 24 hours a day. Intelligence agencies were sharing data. They were no longer looking for each other's weaknesses. They were looking for the next sign of the spires. They were united by a shared, silent fear. "Do you think they will come back?" Reed asked. "I do not think they ever left," Miller replied. He looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "The sensors say the Gulf is clear, but I can still feel the hum. It is in the ground. It is in the air. We were given a second chance because we were a test case. The next time, they might not be so interested in the repairs." The philosophical shift was the most profound. For decades, humanity had measured its progress by the range of its missiles. Now, those measurements were meaningless. The world had been shown its own reflection in the obsidian surface of the spire. The image was small, fragile, and dangerously aggressive. The echo of the return was not just the sound of a missile, it was the sound of a species being told to sit down and be quiet. Miller turned away from the flight line. He left the piece of titanium sitting on the concrete. As he walked toward the transport van, a faint, violet shimmer rippled across the metal fragment. It lasted only a second, a pulse that matched the rhythm of a heartbeat. Then it went cold and gray. The morning in the Persian Gulf had been a tragedy that turned into a mystery. But for those who were in the cockpit, it was a revelation. The war they almost started was the last war of the old world. The new world was one of silence, of shadows, of a power that did not need to fire a shot to win. The sun disappeared behind the peaks. The desert went dark. The hum remained.